Is staff ready? Okay, I have 1 o'clock. So I will call the March 6th, 2024 meeting of the Environmental and Natural Resources Advisory Committee to order. Would you please call the roll?
Elsa Lammers.
Present.
Jessica Gao. Okay. Wendy Anderson. Tyler Momberg. Sarah Lee. Bob Fitzsimmons. John Hoblick. Jack Surratt.
Here.
Bliss Jameson. Bill Lights. Bernie Lafise. Alex Zielinski. Suzanne Scheiber. Donna Brosmer. Okay, and we have just some staff that are listening online, but we don't have anyone participating online, none of the members or anything.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank all the members who attended the resilience workshop a week ago Wednesday. Thank you for taking the time for that. And Ginger may have a comment about that going forward. I don't know. We just need to be careful in any of those workshops not to be in a group together.
Which was tough because there were 7 ENRAC members and 2 breakout groups, but it was a publicly noticed meeting.
Yes.
So, there was at least that. So.
Yeah. And there was no impediment to attendance because it was online. The second thing I'd like to do is thank all the members who were present yesterday in chambers. I saw going around the room, Wendy, Jessica, Jack, and Bill. Was anybody, Suzanne, you were there? I'm sorry, I didn't see you. That's what I was about to ask. Was anybody else there physically or online yesterday? Okay, so 8 of us. And no, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of us. And thank you, Jack and Wendy and Jessica, for your remarks. I'd like to start today. We do have to eventually get to the tree ordinance, but I worked on a summary, sort of a 4-point summary of what I heard yesterday in chambers that I'd like to share with you and then get your feedback about what you heard. And also to inform discussion, I went ahead and downloaded the resolution that formed ENRAC, the charter portion, the portion of the charter that's relevant to ENRAC, the portion of the land development code that's relevant to that resolution, the portion of the July 2022 minutes that established ENRAC, and the Volusia County Council goals for 2024. And that was because of what I heard. So if it's all right, I'd like to share I really tried to cut the summary down to very bare bones. First, it was very clear that a preponderance of the members wanted an update on what ENRAC had done, which was a bit ironic because on the 20th of February, we were slated to give our report that's been ready since the end of the year and our work plan going forward, but they took away that agenda item in favor of a discussion of whether or not all advisory boards would continue or be combined. So we do have that information available. We've been prepared all along. It was always our intent to share that with them, and we are required to share that with them, but I think we would always want to anyway. The second thing that I heard was they requested a change to our priorities. And for texture, at the beginning of the meeting, there were a number of people who are suffering flooding on their existing properties, and that kind of set the tone for the meeting. So they want us to prioritize stormwater, but they didn't really talk about LID, which we presented in October, which of course at the planning phase would work to keep stormwater on a property rather than allowing it to flood a neighboring property. So they want us to deal with that stormwater, but specifically they're looking for flooding. We've had, I think, in the past 20 years, at least 3 100-year floods in the county. So our rules that were based on the 100-year floodplain might not be quite as relevant. Then they also asked ENRAC to go through, at least in my understanding, to reduce the number and complexity of ordinances in order to facilitate permitting. That was another very clear ask. And they asked that ENRAC bring our priorities and goals in line with those of the Volusia County Council goals. I'd like to know what other people heard. I'd also like to say that I find these elements to be in quite a bit of conflict with one another, but perhaps we can find our way through it collectively. So anyone who'd like to speak, I'm opening up.
Can you, the fourth one, what was the fourth item?
The fourth one was to harmonize or bring ENRAC's priorities in line with the Volusia County Council goals for 2024. I know we all have those feelings, but I'm gonna or may have feelings about that, but I'm gonna ask that we really try hard to be serious about this. Mr. Irvin.
Yes, ma'am. Basically, a continuation of what they did from their goal setting last year. You'll see that I think one of the things that they've emphasized is improving efficiency and effectiveness in our permitting process. One of the members is looking hard at our rules and regulations to see if there's overlap with state and federal regulations. And so looking as to whether or not we need to have standards above and beyond minimum standards or deferring to other agencies.
Which is not a new thing.
I suggest if there's a April 30th workshop, which is supposed to be targeting on some discussion of zoning changes where we were taking special exceptions and making them by right, conditional use, or changing the special exception process to allow the Planning and Land Development Regulation Commission to approve some of them rather than going through both the Planning and Land Development Regulation and the County Council, which is actually what we used to do many, many, many years ago. But short story, that's what that workshop is about. But they've also identified a need to discuss some of the permitting issues because we reported back on some of by chapter what's the reason for that specific requirement, and we broke down chapter 72 pretty well and just kind of
This is part of the packet. Excuse me for interrupting.
yes, it will be. And so that's what April 30th may give greater input to this organization, what we're trying to focus on.
We have a question about the time of that workshop, if you know
3
it.
o'clock.
3 p.m. Thank you. I'll just really quickly, Mr. Irvin mentioned 5 priorities: create a more efficient regulatory framework, increase the efficiency and effectiveness of government operations, particularly public safety and economic development related functions, develop and implement a plan for expanded recreation and sports tourism, continue and enhance fiscal stewardship, foster and support a solution-oriented culture. So as he said, the increase efficiency and effectiveness of operation. There you go. Thank you. Does anyone who is there have anything that they'd like to oh, Wendy, thank you.
Yes, in all seriousness. For a solution-oriented culture, yes, the problems that we have all seen and that were presented early yesterday, are county-wide flooding. And they did ask us to focus on that. The storm, it's my understanding, and staff can correct me if I'm wrong, the whole point of the entire stormwater management chapter, the whole point of managing stormwater is to address flood risk. There's nothing about stormwater management that isn't about flooding. So we do need to dive into that chapter. We need to get to that chapter ASAP. And as I've said for 18 months, LID touches all of these chapters, but it is first and foremost a Well, it is a catalog of solutions for stormwater management. We know what the problems are, and we have a whole toolkit of solutions. I also think that, you know, for all of the situations like we heard about yesterday, no laws were broken. No laws were broken in any of those situations where people have chronic flooding, even pre-hurricane flooding. And it's because the laws don't work here. And it is time to change. It is time to change the policies so people stop flooding. That is what has to happen. And we are the body. We are the body that is going to make the recommendations on those policies. And I think it's time for us to get to work and do that. I also think that we have to, as you and Clay were just saying, have to stay mindful of what constraints the state puts on us about that. But where can we, as a county, have more stringent regulations than the state requires? When can we do that? So those are the questions we have to ask. We, as Ginger has reported, from last time, we do have a student intern who is currently working with each of the departments to identify places in the chapters that they work with most regularly to find places that might be barriers to LID or incentives. But yeah, using the code audit tool, the LID code audit tool, and that's great. That's ongoing work, but I don't know that we have to wait for that to be done for us to start our work. I think we can work in parallel. We should work in parallel. We were instructed yesterday to work on this as soon as possible.
Thank you. Jessica.
Wait, I'm here. My takeaway from yesterday is kind of that battle that we're going to have kind of on a policy perspective of lessening regulations while dealing with impacts that are currently permitted. And so I think looking at the balance of, I'll caveat that I think that we've come a long way since 1985, right? In terms of regulation and the scope and the protections. But we have a lot of aging infrastructure. We have maintenance issues. We have things that we hear from residents every single day. You know, you can design a project, but that relies on upkeep. It relies on county maintenance of canal systems. It relies on all of these things. And how do we build in protection for those elements as well? Not only just capacity and treatment, but long-term maintenance, enforcement, and things like that. So.
Thank you. And I just, for 1 second, going back to the LID and stormwater, I believe, and Ginger and and Keith, correct me if I'm mistaken, Wendy emphasized that it only deals with flooding. I think we said that one of the issues that it could deal with too would be water quality. I think Tyler might have said that. Tyler was the one who said that. And also the underlying legal stuff that supports our committee does talk about stopping pollutants. That's a direct mandate that we have. Thank you, Bill. I'm just going to go around, go that way. Okay, Jack.
Thanks. I found the meeting interesting yesterday. You know, we went from being disbanded completely to meeting twice as much. You know, we're insignificant and then vitally important. And by the way, solve that flooding problem while you're at it. You know, today, you know, let's work that in right now. So I heard it essentially the same, but a couple things. One, the update issue I found real interesting, and I've had a lot of experience in businesses where, you know, folks want updates. That means we're not particularly happy with what's going on there. So we need to know more about what you guys are up to. And so my recommendation is to go beyond what the requirement is and give them more updates, because I think if they had a fuller understanding of what we were dealing with, I think it'd be good to them. And so perhaps we should do it to where we're putting more things together and showing them along the way, even if we don't have recommendations, but, you know, evaluations, or we're finding an issue. I think that would be valuable to them. And I think, as much as they didn't say that, and I thought the same thing, you know, we have it here if you want to see it. Right. And so I think there could be more updates that may be helpful. The priorities, you know, I think were interesting, and I think appropriate. They're dealing with a flooding issue, which is current and apparent right there. And I think, it definitely fits in what we're doing. And so they thought, hey, here's a group that can maybe get that straight. To me, what's interesting about it is we're trying to deal with the things that help flooding in the future, not drain the flooding of today. And that was kind of where they were as I saw it. They were thinking, how can we make this go away now? And you guys solve that problem by working twice as hard. So, I think they're a little misguided in that approach. And I think they're dealing with a current problem that has been festering for an extended period of time. And as we've talked about before, we're taking a more proactive role at addressing these ordinances and rules to try to help it going in the future. And I think it'll have an immediate result, but I'm not kind of what they're looking for. I think ours are more long-term solutions. As to priorities in general, I think that, and fitting, harmonizing. Let's talk about the harmonizing thing. Yeah, I get that. I think a lot of it is trying to reduce regulations. I think it's being thrown into the big hopper of less government, less red tape. I don't want to have to get a permit for that shed I want to build in the back. It's into this big picture, which is really understandable. Everybody wants to do those things, and I think it's true. There are things that we can streamline and make them better, and perhaps condense things to where there are less hoops to jump through. Maybe so, and who needs that? But the bottom line is, in order to improve a lot of these circumstances, there are more regulations. There are more things that probably have to be put in place, and that's a hard. You don't get the cake and eat it too here, and I think they want a bit of that, and I think that eventually that will come to pass when we recommend things to them and we say, hey, by the way, we think this is a better way to go. And I think LID is, low impact development is a great example. Oh, we like that voluntarily, but gee, let's
Sorry,
step into that.
Just a reminder, in October when they heard the LID, we were under SB 250. They couldn't.
I know, and it was easy to punt it. Yeah, but I wonder what the situation would be today, and I'm not sure it'd be much different. But perhaps, there can be some harmonizing. Anyway, as far as priorities, I think we have our priorities straight. I think it's just that we have to shuffle the deck because they've got an issue that they see as more immediate, and I agree. So it's not, that's no big deal. I think it's on this, it's slated there. I think the connection to LID is going to be most interesting because that is an obvious way to try to solve the problems, or some of them. I don't know. I thought the meeting was okay, and as a friend of mine put it, they always become more receptive when the pitchforks come out, and we were, and so everybody was very supportive of ENRAC at the end, but to begin, they probably weren't. So anyway, I'm glad to be here and have our meeting today.
Thank you, Jack. I'm just going right down the table. So Bob.
That's a really good, no, that's a very good question because, if we're already working towards it, what is it that we're doing? Ben Bartlett and his folks over Road and Bridge, Lori Coons, who oversees that division, they are aware of it. Trust me, on a daily basis, the amount of calls, and it's not just from the area where Mr. Figueroa lives. We're experiencing it over in New Smyrna Beach. We're experiencing it in northwest areas. We're experiencing it basically anywhere anyone lives. We are experiencing flooding at this point. And a lot of it is going to be, first of all, looked at from Road and Bridge as to what is it impacting on our facilities? Does the facilities that the county manages and maintains, is there anything that we need to be doing? Is there a blockage? Then it's going to be digging down into the larger, like kind of 10,000 foot view. Is there something obvious that has occurred? Is there something that's, we hear that development is occurring. Okay. Have they done something outside of their plans that have been approved, or are those plans that were approved erroneous? So we're kind of going through this. Ms. Scheibert's gone through that right now with up near Halifax Plantation, where Old Dixie gets inundated with water. And sometimes it's not necessarily related to rain events. So there's some concerns there. Lake Talmadge is another example. We've gone in there. So we're working through all of those on individual basis. I think that long term, you're probably going to need to have updates to a lot of our basin studies that we have. Because at the heart of whatever you do from a public works perspective, whatever you do from a regulatory perspective, you need to know what that storm basin consists of, where it's coming, where it's going. And I know that Ben Bartlett has identified a need to update many of our basin studies.
Anything that you said, we need that information. Of course, we need to get out of this basin thinking, because the basin up here, when it drains into the basin down here, and so anyway, that gets more technical into the whole thing.
Could I just interject?
Can I
Sorry.
finish?
Yep.
My anecdotal, I've been in this county for almost 40 years. I've been in Florida my entire life. My anecdotal observation, and that's why I'm asking you this question, and it doesn't look like anyone has done it. Anecdotally, I would have to say that 75 to 85% of all the flooding that I ever see, when I drive around and investigate just my eyeballs and what I understand about stormwater, it's caused by the fact that we have 100 years worth of sins preceding us. Whether you're looking at the flooding downtown DeLand that buries the corner of Florida and 44, or many other areas, they're past sins that need to be corrected. And the reason I think a study like this and that information is so important is we need to know where to focus. Should we really be focusing on all the new stuff coming down the pipe, or should we be focusing on trying to repair all the sins of the past?
Thank you, Bob. As we go through this too, and we talk about what we can focus on, is it actionable for ENRAC? And just as an aside, Flagler County just greenlit a huge expenditure to fix those past sins. Ginger, sorry.
I just wanted to throw out there that the discussion about the council meeting and all that, I think we're pretty clear that our priority for tackling next is stormwater. And when we do that, when we have these conversations that we're starting to have now, we really probably want to do that when we have the public works folks here as the experts, because we aren't those experts. And so I'm not trying to stifle conversation or anything, but those conversations probably need to happen at the next meeting when those guys are here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. That helps keep us on track, because really we're just doing the top line of the meeting, but it is all good discussion. Suzanne, you were up next.
So I was at the meeting yesterday, and the gentleman who got up and spoke had a 5-minute news story, 5 full minutes on television with him and his neighbors and their flooding. Everything that Jack said, I 100% spot on. The only thing I'm going to tack on to that is sitting there listening to them. It was like this committee was going to fix previous flooding, like what Mr. Fitzsimmons just said. So the question that I have is, are we here to fix previous flooding, or are we here to look at future flooding? Because at this point, I don't feel confused, or at least I didn't. But based on yesterday, I am asking, because there is, and there are times that new neighborhoods go to previous neighborhoods, and I believe flooding or new subdivision was approved in that area that was already flooded. So I don't know. I'm asking.
That's exactly the sort of the same question I ask if it's the purview of ENRAC, but I think when the road and bridge people are here and can talk about, because we are examining standards and ordinances. We're not allocating funding. So when road and bridge is here, I think they'll delineate for us those things that might be in our bailiwick and those things that are really outside of our ability to approach. Thank you. And Mr. Rechtenwald even stated that. He said ENRAC really looks more toward future things, and what they're suffering through as a council right now is a bunch of people angry about the flooding in their homes currently. Tyler.
So I think one of the things that I take away, and I had a little bit of a heads up because it was on the news last week and like was just mentioned. And so I've been doing a little bit of research on what science is there on establishing groundwater tables. And, we have flooding in different parts of the county that have different characteristics. The flooding that's happening between Nova and US 1 and Holly Hill through Port Orange, that's a basin that really doesn't have a lot of fall to sea level. It's only drained by man-made canals. They are under a patchwork of maintenance. It's not one agency. They're not equally maintained, and they may be over capacity in many locations. So that flooding issue, nothing that we do here is going to make a difference about. That's going to require funding from council. The issues in New Smyrna are somewhat similar. They're a little different, but that's not really necessarily an issue that I see us solving. The flooding that happens in DeLand, that happens on our sand ridge here, which is more closed basin type of drainage. We don't have direct discharge to the ocean, or at least not quick discharge to the ocean. It's really hard for us to establish what is the seasonal high groundwater table. And FDEP has guidance that you use basically soil staining indicators, the iron deposits and the erosion of those deposits as an indicator of where is your typical seasonal high. For our stormwater design, we typically use soil borings. There's some methods of using a grid and looking at slope of groundwater surface and some other things and measuring with piezometers that our geotech engineers have been recommending the last few years. But ultimately, there's a lot of areas of science that go into our design. The different flooding types are going to require us to look at different things. And part two of this, Wendy mentioned that we've had a lot of large storm events. The way that affects us in DeLand versus the way that affects somebody in the more eastern coastal basins is substantial. And so that's where, as we start seeing these increased rainfall events, we may need to be looking at what is the science on that. I don't know that there's really been a study since the early 90s. I think 1991 is the newest data that we have.
Thank you. If it's okay, let's save, that's going to be extremely valuable information when we get into it in the actual stormwater element. Bill, you were up next.
Just some of the same kind of things. One is that the stormwater ordinance will talk about water quality, not just flooding. And New Smyrna Beach did a study after Ian that looked at whether the new development was causing the flooding, and it showed it wasn't. It's the old stuff. So we're going to have to grapple with this, we're talking about ordinances now for new development, and how do you go back? So a lot of the statements of all this new development, the way that it's happening is causing all this flooding is a bit misleading. And I don't think that, that's kind of what we have been hearing. And I think it's important to kind of realize that maybe it's not. So.
Thank you, Bill. I think first and foremost, our methodology is to fact find as best as we can. And when we have the proper group here, that'll be helpful. And then look at where we can make a recommendation that will help things. And where there's nothing that says we can't say, look, we found this was outside our purview, but we think you should be looking at it with the appropriate body. I don't know that we have to say anything about the other part of the asks that are kind of outside ENRAC, or just as we go through, we'll just look at them all. Okay. So I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Bliss. It's hiding behind your drink, please.
Well, I apologize to all of you for being late. I had wanted to hear the beginning of this conversation. I had listened to the meeting, but Ginger, I wanted to ask you, you just said that Ben Bartlett and Road and Bridge people will be here next time. Are they going to have a presence at more of our meetings, or?
Yeah, so for the duration of the conversation about stormwater and flooding, they're going to be the subject matter experts because that's their section of the code to implement, and they're the engineers and that sort of thing. So we'll meet with them before the next meeting and kind of talk to them about how we run our meetings. We try to get information out early and give you guys things to look at and all those sorts of things. But the information that you're going to be reviewing is really going to come out of their shop. So
Okay. And with that, I also wanted to ask about any other department being represented, at our meetings. Several of the councilmen were talking about how, diverse well-diverse and knowledgeable our committee is. But then in the staff, we have very knowledgeable staff here, but we only have one department. And so this is Road and Bridge coming is great, but if you also listen to the council, they're saying that, and especially Chair Brower's comments was, we want to attract business. We don't want to scare them away. So with that, are we going to have an economic development department person attend our meetings? I mean, because that is one of the things that I say continually is, is it balanced, and are there going to be any unintended consequences, economic consequences based on the decisions and recommendations that we are putting forth? I see Clay.
I'm going to give you a quick answer. We are fortunate enough to have just hired Lou Paris as our new Economic Development Division Director. He has been tasked with working with our staff to come up with for lack of a better term, an ombudsman role. So I'm sure that Lou will be involved with the discussions that are occurring here as well. Whether he makes it to every meeting, I cannot say that just yet, because I'm sure he's got quite a lot on his plate right now walking into it. But he will be provided with the agendas. Again, we share the agendas that are available for the staff members that want to participate. We'll just make sure that he's aware that there is an interest in making sure that his comments are also included.
Thank you. Would that mean the ombudsman would be, attending the meetings in his place?
Well, no, that they would be the ombudsman role. Economic Development Division is going to take on a role as an ombudsman to help navigate our business interests through the county's development process when needed.
Oh, okay. I'm aware of that. I was just, didn't know if they would have a presence at this meeting.
Yeah, so we will make sure that Cyrus Callum is aware of it, who's the Director of Airport and Economic Development, as well as Lou Paris, our new Economic Development Director, so that way they can have an interest in participation here in this event or
Okay.
this organization.
Well, with that said, we're bringing in the Road and Bridge people and the storm people because they are the ones that have that knowledge and understand all the ins and outs of those questions. But here, the question I'm asking about economic development representation is we don't have their comments and their input into how our decisions are going to impact economic development until after the fact. They aren't here to discuss it with us and have impact on the recommendations that we make.
And I'm asking this as clarification. So yesterday there were all these advisory boards, and the advisory boards all have things that they're supposed to be looking at, and they're supposed to tell the county what the county council, what their recommendation is, what their findings are. Each of those boards in a way is kind of a purist board. They're examining, and our responsibility is to ensure that the minimum standards protect the environment from harm. The council gets to decide, okay, before we take action on this one, we're going to send it over to another department. We're going to look at it in another way, some kind of other analysis, but we will have complied with our responsibility of evaluating whether the standards are correct. At least that's my understanding. I don't know if Clay wants to tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah. Internally share information amongst departments. We try to avoid silos between departments as much as possible. I hear your concern. I will make sure that Lou is aware of that and making sure that they are monitoring what's going on here and participate to the best of their ability, because you're correct, it does meld into some of the goals that were identified by the council both last year and this year. So we'll make sure that we integrate them into the preparation of the documents, the review of the documents, and where they deem appropriate, they can be in attendance. At this point, I'm not certain that I can mandate that they be there, but I can make sure that their presence is requested by the board.
Early.
Something for consideration at the next meeting. New Smyrna Beach did do a study right after Hurricane Ian and Nicole, and it was solely for the purpose of evaluating the flooding and the impact of the stormwater regulations, new development versus conditions. And there is a significant part of unincorporated Volusia over in the New Smyrna area, and water flows don't observe jurisdictional boundaries. And I remember being at the meeting where the consulting engineers presented, and to my knowledge, they are an outfit that limits their practice to public sector clients. And it may be worthy of some knowledge of that study, because I think we're hearing some issues. Certainly you can't ignore what water tables are, what are being used to calculate stormwater requirements, and what storm events are we still using when we start getting into the code. So it may be meaningful to have some familiarity with that study, whether that be with county staff. And I suspect county staff has looked at that study.
Mr. Evans nodding his head yes. So that's what I was about to ask.
We'll get it
Yeah,
out.
our pre-read. Thank you. Wendy.
So on that topic, I've read that study carefully several times, forwards and backwards. I've studied their maps. I've studied their data that they used. I have spoken with elected officials in New Smyrna and city staff. The purpose of that study, just to kind of put a critical thinking angle on this, the purpose of that study was to protect the city. It was to determine if the city was at fault for any of the flooding that happened. CYA, we'll call it a CYA. And of course the engineering firm found that they were not at fault. So I just want to point that out, that was the purpose and that was the outcome. And yet they had a sample size of 2. They focused on 2 developments and determined that those 2 developments did not cause any flooding to surrounding areas. Well, one of those developments doesn't have any surrounding areas. And the other one, the floodway off of their property goes into an undeveloped area. And so So, I mean, in my opinion, the study was somewhat flawed, and I think we should review it as a study, but I think we need to go into it with some critical thinking.
Thank you. So when we get to discussing, right now, we're just kind of talking agendas, prospective agenda, stormwater. So that's a study we can bring in and we can re-critique at that time. Tyler?
So to finish what I was going to say earlier, that's not getting too much into the weeds of the sciences. Growing up, I know that when I was very young, the house that my parents lived in right before I was born, the whole yard went underwater when I was about 3 years old. And that was a regular occurrence. It didn't happen for another 20 years. And then it happened again when I was about 20. And then it didn't happen again until last year. And now it's happening again now. So we've been through a drought cycle. We're at kind of the wettest point that we've been in a long period of time. And so some of this flooding is showing up. That's one of the realities that we all need to go into this with. I do think it's important that we have a discussion of stormwater. I do think it's important that we recognize that a lot of the flooding is historic. I pulled up the New Smyrna study just because I wanted to see what it was showing. They found 1,348 reported flood locations. I'm looking at the map and it's like a heat map of the intercoastal. So if the intercoastal stages up and floods the property, there's absolutely nothing that any of us are going to do with stormwater code that's going to have anything to do with tidal rise. Those are things that I also want to make sure that we look at. I mean, there are some other areas that there's flooding on the south side of State Road 44 between I-95 and the intercoastal. There's kind of poor drainage from there. There's not a lot of canals or other things. So there are going to be some things that we can draw conclusions from, but I think in a large context, it's really wet right now versus what
It
it's
is.
been in a long.
It is. So just something to remember, the county council is getting yelled at. And the council doesn't like to get yelled at. And our job is to look at the facts like you're talking about, but when we go through the stormwater work that we're going to do, okay? Because we got to do trees today. Sorry to be
Yeah,
kind of
stormwater will be
pushy.
if we get through trees.
Yes. And Suzanne, okay. So thank you, Suzanne. So if it's okay, another thing that was said yesterday, but it didn't get on my list of 4 things. But another thing that was mentioned was our speed. And in all fairness, it took us a long time to figure out how to work efficiently. And I think that was very appropriate. It's taken the council a long time to figure out how to work together. It took them about a year. And we came up with for this year the presentation by staff of the issues, and they give us pre-reads, and we look at these issues in the light of the pre-reads, and we discuss with staff. Then we come back and discuss some more. And I'm going to propose that we try to do everything that we do in 3 meetings. So staff presentation and discussion, then deep dive discussion, and then discussion with an eye toward we're finalizing. We might not get there, but I'm proposing that be something that we strive for as a committee. Okay, thank you. So let's climb trees. And always with your thinking cap on and always being polite to one another.
Okay. So left off on page 15 last time. We had, at last meeting, we had a motion to bring back language about the right of way. We went back and looked at some of our notes and previous meetings, and the board had previously voted to strike that language. So we didn't bring any language back because you had already previously voted that. So that is our mistake. You,
I guess I will recap. So there was some language in the exemptions about exemptions for road projects, and we had quite a bit of discussion about this a year ago, and then we had discussion about it again at our last meeting. What we failed to tell you at the last meeting was you in fact made a decision a year ago to just strike that language. So the discussion that we had last time, last month, you didn't make another motion. It was all fine. We don't have competing motions or anything, or but just where we left it last time was we'd bring you back some language, but in fact you had already decided that, so we didn't bring back language. So we're done with that. Yeah. I just didn't want you to have an expectation that we were going to talk about it again, and we don't have to, unless you wanted to revisit it and remove that old motion and all that.
Which whoever made the motion has to do that.
this is just illustrated, but I don't think we have to start here. We go to the. Well, we talked about it in a previous meeting. I mean, unless they want to revisit the 15%, the replacement costs, or the 20% of the lot clearance.
We did.
Yeah. Okay. So, some of you that were previously here, we had discussed this before. The code currently requires 15% replacement of the total cross-sectional square inches that are removed from the site. Commercial is a little bit different than residential. In residential, we're only looking at the buildable area or the zoning setback areas, not the buildable area for replacement. In commercial, like a final site plan, we'd be looking for the entire site. So this is just a general statement, and I'm explaining the. Yeah. So yeah, here's an example. This is a residential lot. You can see that all the trees that are in the buildable area are being removed. However, they're not required to replace those trees unless they're historic trees.
When you say commercial, you're in, it's great. You're including subdivisions, residential subdivisions. Okay, so does that include residential subdivisions?
What, tree replacement? Yes.
Yeah, the tree replacement is the whole lot when you're subdividing.
What's the entire cleared area?
Yeah, but just for
Yeah,
clarity.
and your infrastructure, your roadways, your retention. Yes. So there are two sections in the tree code. Okay, can we go back? Yeah. So they're basically the 3 Ps for how you replace the trees. You can plant, you can preserve, you can plant, and you can pay. Obviously, we prefer that you preserve trees on site, whether they be in tree preservation areas or in your zoning setback areas. Our next preference is planting, and our last option is payment, or you can do a combination of all 3. Any questions on that, Tyler? You got your John?
So I remember us reviewing this last year and going through this, and the formula, I think, adds hours of extra work for large scale. So why can't we just use the 15% of the DBH versus going through all of this formula? I mean, you got a 10-inch tree, replace it with the 50, that 15% smaller when you go and replant. I mean, that's a lot of math for an engineer and that group to go through. I mean, if you count 100 trees and you got that much DBH, then why can't you just, I just trying to simplify the formula or simplify the madness behind the method.
It's fairly simple. I mean, pi r squared is, I mean, it's a fairly simple formula. So it's, I mean, that's an industry, you know, a lot of industry standards. I mean, Ormond Beach does 10% of the cross-sectional square inches. So, I mean, if you're wanting to reduce the cross, you know, the percentage wise, I mean, it's a typical, some cities, your municipalities use something that's like a canopy percentage, which that is absolutely terrible to do. Figure out how much of the property is canopied and then replace all that canopy. Well, you can't really replace all of that canopy. So you have to, you know, you have to start somewhere.
So I get that, but my question is, how do you simplify that? And just by using DBH rather than going through a formula? I mean, we're talking about trying to make things easier in the permitting process and doing these kind of things. I'm just asking why we can't do it a simpler process.
So I just did the math real quick. So a 15-inch tree, if you said you have to replace 15% of the DBH, it's a 2.25 DBH is 15% of 15. Okay. If you do it the cross-sectional square inch way, you would have to replace 23 cross-sectional square inches, which is equal to a 3-inch DBH tree. So it comes out, I mean, a little bit, it's close to the same. It's actually a little bit less. Three inch trees.
So yeah,
So it's a lot. So if you do 15% of the DBH, the replacement is significantly less.
so is the goal to,
Same amount of replacement, you could say it would be 30% of the DBH.
so yeah,
50% of
is your goal to plant back more trees or to plant fewer trees?
His goal is to make the process
Easier. Okay. I mean, I think that's probably the easiest calculation that Tyler's got, you know, has to deal with.
I will say this too, we do provide folks with a spreadsheet where all they have to do is plug in how many of each size tree and it does the math for you. But yeah, if you're, you know, a owner builder or something, there's a little bit of explanation that happens with cross-sectional area.
And owner builders, we help them through the process. We'll help them do the math. We'll help them through the entire thing. So.
Oh, you decided to, oh, okay. Okay, go for it.
Goal is to make it simpler. And we currently have an ordinance that, you know, tries to assess everything that's on site and then establish some replacement schedule. But our ordinance also has a minimum in there. So it would seem to me that, you know, at least in residential developments, you know, maybe this wouldn't apply to commercial. But since you already have a minimum number of trees that have to go on a home site, you know, to go through all those calculations in all of the area where home sites exist, you know, it seems to me to be a horrible waste of energy, time, money, the whole 9 yards, when, as your, you know, the description that you put up there, you know, we get to exclude this area and we only count those areas. And rather than, you know, doing something like that, focus on, you know, maybe the right of way, you know, the preservation area, certainly, and make the minimum more stringent, but get rid of all of the silly calculations that you have to go through on, and again, just for purposes of discussion, on home sites 1 acre or less, or, you know, where you're not, and again, everything that I propose to try and simplify this process excludes specimen and historic trees, I'm all for trying to do whatever we can to save, truly historic trees, not laurel oaks, but live oaks. Cypress trees. Big pines,
I would,
blackjacks.
I would say that if you make it, you make it cheaper, you have less replacement, you're not saving trees. What saves the trees is that it costs to replace them. It's the money factor.
If you have a minimum, I mean, I don't want to get on a one-on-one back and forth here, Keith, but if you have.
There is a minimum.
I know, but it's one tree per 2,500, thank you, square feet. So, on an acre piece of property, that's 16 trees. And, at 1.5 inches a piece, that's pretty minimal. So if you leave the discretion of which trees to save and all your saved trees continue to be counted towards whatever that more stringent minimum standard is, I don't see how you end up with fewer trees or how you end up in a situation where the builder doesn't want to save those trees if it's at all reasonably possible.
Mhm.
But you eliminate all the rigmarole in between.
I'll ask a question about that. So, I think for sure if we did something like that, the minimum needs to change, right? Because one tree per 2,500 square feet is very few.
Absolutely, yeah.
But then are we, is there an unintended consequence where because every lot is different, right? Or every area is different. So there are some lots where we come across where there are a lot of trees and maybe they're it's nice habitat, it's good trees. And then there are some areas that, there are very few trees or they're really, cruddy or whatever. So I don't know, but I mean, maybe there's a value in having a way to do that recognizes what exists there now, rather than treating every just because it's a single family lot, treating them the same. I don't know.
If you had a more stringent minimum standard, it would, I don't know, my brain, it seems to me it would balance out. If you're building or developing in an area that doesn't have any trees, you're going to have to put a whole lot there. And yes, the area that has a lot of trees may suffer, but the truth of the matter is, in a residential development, those trees are going to go anyway, and the builder is going to have to pay, because you can't save all of those trees in a high density subdivision.
There is already a way in the code to do what you're talking about. It's the 1 per 1,000 option on individual lots, and we discussed that last year. So you wouldn't have to do any of these calculations. You would just replant one tree per 1,000 square foot of lot space on the individual lots. That's already in the code. We already have a way to do that. So if you're talking about doing these individual lots this way, there is something in the code already that handles that situation, and builders use it all the time. It's still the minimum size tree.
Excuse me, staff, for a second. It would be very helpful for those of us who do not do this all the time for a living if we specified that our comments are to residential or subdivisions, so that you might have, and I might not have heard you. It might have gone over my head. That can happen.
I was specifically talking about residential.
But one like owner builder,
No.
subdivision.
But all of the
Okay.
lots
That's
that-
what I mean. Just always say, I'm talking about subdivision here.
But those regulations apply.
But they weren't. Okay. See, here we go.
But those regulations apply the same on the singular lots.
No, we've got a side-by-side slide with differences somewhere in there, I recall seeing, but
Well, it's just an area that they exclude. It's the buildable area.
There are rules for existing single-family lots, already platted lots. That's the picture you have up here. And there is an option for lots under a certain size to choose this 1 per 1,000, where the minimum is higher, but you don't have to do any of the tree survey or removal and replacement calculations. A new subdivision where you're creating new lots, that doesn't follow these same rules.
Right.
Those are different. And that, in that case, it's up to the developer how to permit the tree removal on those lots. Either it can be permitted through, at the time of the subdivision, or they can leave all the trees on the lots, do the infrastructure, the ponds, the roads, all that. And each lot gets permitted at the time of building permit, and then it would follow these
follows
rules,
those.
right? So it really depends on how that subdivision is permitted. So I think it is important to make sure exactly, kind of what kind of development we're talking about, because the rules do vary. Well, yes and no, because if at the time of the subdivision, the developer says, I'm not going to clear, if they say, I'm going to clear the lots in the subdivision, okay, then there's removal and replacement on that entire lot. If they say, I'm going to leave the lots wooded, and as each individual home comes in for permitting, they'll follow whatever the tree rules are, then it would be this, where only the trees in the setbacks are, or the 1 per 1,000, right? So it's really at that point up to how the developer sets up that subdivision. But any existing platted lots that aren't exempt, right, because they're not one of the exempt categories, follow these rules.
And I just kind of want to point out really quickly, and we discussed this last year, that, and you can't really see it because we can't zoom into it, but this particular lot, they removed a lot of trees, right? And you would think, looking at this, that if you develop this way, you would owe a lot in tree replacement. They saved a couple of trees in the buildable area, and those trees counted towards all their replacement. They owed zero. So if you do your subdivision and you set it up to where you cleared the lots individually, you save the trees in the zoning setback areas, and you save a couple of trees in the buildable area, well, then your tree replacement pretty much goes away.
Thank you. Tyler, then Bill, then Wendy.
So I think existing platted lots, the single lot stuff, there's a pretty big exemption in place effectively against replacement. So I don't really have a lot of comments on that. I also don't deal with it a lot with what we do professionally. I've had one subdivision out of dozens that we've done that didn't require complete regrading of the lots in order to make the stormwater work. The land that's left to develop in the county is relatively low. Talking about the fact that stormwater code is coming up, if you're subdividing land, you're probably regrading the lots unless it's some special circumstance, larger lot, something. So looking at it under the context that we have to kind of replace everything, 3 of the goals are increase efficiency, to have better fiscal stewardship, and to have a more solution-oriented culture. Back at the beginning of all of this conversation over a year ago, I said that I have a problem with the fact that we look at replacement instead of a prescriptive solution. I think Bob was kind of saying the same thing. Yeah, that instead of saying, hey, we need to go survey these trees, we need to figure out what the area of tree here is, do a bunch of maths, figure out how we're replacing them and paying into the fund. We say we need to have this much for this 100 acres. And if you want to go survey the trees that you're going to save and count them, if you want to, whatever, do that. The only thing it leaves is we have specimen trees and historic trees that we still need to identify. There is still a survey component, but tree survey takes a while and it's expensive. So talking about ways that we can streamline our process, I felt from the beginning that we could get the same end results with the prescriptive policy. And in fact, that avoids all of the things of these folks having to chase after somebody that owns land under an ag zoning, clears all the trees, makes it more valuable to a developer, and then a few years later sells it. Those types of things are worthless all of a sudden if it's a prescription of minimum coverage.
Right, and so that I don't get that entirely. I don't understand that entirely. So explain it to me like I'm a 5-year-old, please.
So a forest can only grow so densely. When we cut down a forest and we replace at some ratio, against the densest forest, we're achieving some coverage, and against a field, we're achieving zero coverage with replacement.
Let me ask my question another way. From what I know, I'm going to develop a subdivision, a large property, and it's got trees on it right now. And right now, I hire someone to do a tree survey, and they're going to flag any specimen or historic trees in there, but they're also going to do a sampling of what kinds of trees are in there and how many there are of them. Do they use sampling? They're not going to go count every single tree. They're going to do,
Everything's 6 inches and bigger.
Okay. okay, it has to be like, okay, 6 inches. Okay, so there's one labor thing there. They're going in there counting every tree. I'll use the busiest example. And so now we know we've done our survey and we know what we have in terms of specimen. We know what we have in terms of any historic trees, and we know how many trees we have 6 inches or bigger that will trigger my replacement or protection or payment options. Yes?
Correct.
Okay. So take me from there.
So from nice to us and does 1 foot per inch. So at least I don't have to use pi or anything else there. So if we impact more than 25% of the root zone, it is assumed that we have killed the tree. There is some wiggle room that we can work with Keith and, but just in a closed box interacting with just myself, I have to assume I kill the tree. So I need to know trees beyond my lot lines if I'm grading to my lot line, things of that nature. So then I do my math, I figure out what my replacement is, I lay out my development, I figure out where I can put trees, and I see if I'm paying into the tree fund or not. And that's pretty much it. At the end of the day, I lay out my development.
Either way, same example, starting at that same point, we did do a survey. Take me the,
So I know where my specimen and historic trees that I need to avoid are. I may be able to take some of them out, or, that may be a conversation, but I'm gonna know where those are. I'm gonna lay out my subdivision. I take my minimum coverage. I survey my trees that are remaining. I apply that and I go, okay, this is how much more I need. I lay out my trees. I see if I meet the minimum coverage or not, and whether I have to pay into the tree fund. I'm done. It saves me the survey of everything that I'm clearing. So basically what I'm suggesting is if we're going to kill the trees, why are we spending money on them?
let me just paraphrase what I understood you to say to make really, really sure. You're saying instead of surveying every single tree and calculating what you have to pay and put back, you're saying, let me just look at my buildable area where I'm actually going to be taking out trees.
I'm saying, look at the total lot size and have a coverage of, right now it's 1 tree per 2,500 square feet. So say it was 50 trees per acre and I had 100 acres, I need 5,000 trees now. I need a minimum size that tree is defined as. So some municipalities call it 6 inches. Now I need 5,000 times 6 inches of DBH on my site. If I preserve it in existing trees, if I plant it with replacement, however I get there, I've achieved my coverage, and I don't have to survey all the area that's going to be cleared. It's going to save me time on the front end, and it's going to save me money on the front end.
Well, you can currently do a statistical analysis without surveying all the trees. That's already in the code. It happens all the time. I mean, every week we're looking at statistical analysis. So they do a couple of plots and they come up with a cross-sectional square inch per foot and apply it over those areas. It happens on actually most developments. So they located every single tree. That's rare. And most of the time they only have to actually survey the specimens and the historics, and everything else can be done as statistical.
Just on the idea of a prescription, is there a way, like how would we encourage preservation of existing trees over clear cutting and replanting of trees? Because it's not like it's a terrible idea, right? Like if you end up and you'd have to figure out how do you end up at the same place, right? Like what is that prescription that gets you where you get now or something? But how do you
You focus on
we
the
would
trunk
we
area.
would really want to encourage people to preserve what's there rather than
Yeah.
cut down what's there and put back something new.
It's that you look at the trunk area instead of just the DBH, because the existing trees that are 9, 10, 12-inch diameter trees have a lot more area to them than a 4-inch tree. And a 4-inch tree is expensive. If I go buy a 4-inch oak tree at any nursery today, it's over $500 right now. So it, you know, installed.
Yeah.
Am I wrong?
And that, yeah, yeah. And that encourages you to keep more trees.
But also, Jessica, you had your
Sorry.
card. Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
I would, I encourage everybody to go back and look at pictures of Stetson and our wonderful city that's known as, you know, the Oak City of the world. Back when it started, the whole area was clear cut, you know, thousands of acres, clear cut. And what do we have today? So one of the things that happens with the method that I think, you know, both Tyler and I are trying to promote is I now put trees in areas where they're likely to thrive. If I am forced to save a tree through economics, which I am regularly forced to do, that tree oftentimes is not in an area where it's going to thrive. It's going to fall on the person's house in a few years. I'm sorry? No, when I save it, when I'm forced. Well, exactly. You know, even if I'm not, you know, I've got a house here, I've got a house here, and each, you know, home is 15 feet away from the tree. Or, you know, and whatever had to happen. I mean, I'm not speaking out of turn when I'm telling you that I've had 3 homes that I've built in my career that were axed by trees that were saved during the development process. All right, they came down in a storm, they went right through the middle of the house. And in all 3 of those instances, I fought at the time not to save the trees. You know, so we do things. One subdivision was in a sand pine, I think they're called, the stands that are real close together. I think those are sand pines, aren't they, Keith? The ones that grow real, yeah, that they have to be close together to survive. You know, every one of them is 80 feet tall and they don't have a branch for the first 50 feet. And back in the early days of the tree ordinance, they forced me to save a couple of hundred of those things. Fortunately, most of them didn't chop houses in half because we were able to keep them away. But none of those trees should have been saved except in an area where they're all nice and tightly together. All right. Again, just going back to a nice, and I'm all for that prescriptive method being way more stringent than it is right now, but it gives us the latitude to come back and go, hey, I can put trees along here and they're all going to live. And I'm not going to do what they did in Victoria Park and put all my oak trees this far from the curb and that far from the sidewalk directly over the utilities easement. Okay. I'm going to put them back just a little bit, like I did in Glenwood Springs down here off of 15A. The subdivision is 20 or 25 years old now. We set them 10 foot off the sidewalks on both sides. Hey, guess what? We got a canopy 25 years later.
Look at the live oaks that line the boulevard.
Well, exactly.
Now,
every one of those are planted.
Buckled.
And
but you can't guarantee those trees are going to stay there either. When you sell the lot, what we see that all the time
with all respect, Keith, you can't guarantee that any tree's going to stay there forever, whether it's one I saved or one I planted.
Right.
We're going to do everything we can to see that they are, but there are no guarantees there.
Right, but what I'm saying is just planting the lots and saying that those trees are going to be here and they're going to have a canopy in 50 years. What we're seeing when we're coming back out and doing our reinspection is we're seeing a lot of these trees have been removed. They remove them, they put in non-native species, they just take them down.
Which is another section of what we have to talk about.
Yeah.
So I want Bill and Jessica and Wendy to have their say. But I want to reiterate something that you said, Bob, and a tree is not a tree is not a tree because some of them have horticultural requirements like the sand pines needing to be in stands and not as isolated trees. But our code looks at them as a tree is a tree is a tree. And I know Tyler's had thoughts on that are different. But Bill, actually, no, Jessica, because she's been waiting a long time.
Your turn. I just wanted to ask on the statistical analysis, because I know that it's possible. I know it's possible, but is it clearly outlined in the code kind of when that applies and what methods, or is it kind of a case by case? They bring it forward and you say, oh, we think 3 plots here, it has to be the same habitat type, or how does that, that's not laid out in the code right now, right?
Well, yeah, it states that the habitat has to be of like species. So like if you have like a mixed hardwood area and you have a pine area, you would just, do your transects and then cover those particular areas.
And perfect, and I know that's how it works, but can somebody who's not us go to the code and say, got it, instead of doing a full tree survey, I just do this? Is that in the code? Because that may be helpful.
Well, yeah, I think we also tell people this consistently too. We get questions all the time. Do I have to do a full tree survey? I mean, the answer is no, you don't have to do. You can do a statistical.
I just want to avoid the situation where we pull subdivision requirements and it says full tree survey. And we
Right.
can say, but here's the alternative outlined in
Yeah.
there.
And when we're writing this tree ordinance, we're talking about, reorganizing things and putting things, we have a section where you're going to have all your requirements for each individual submittal, and all that stuff will be, bulletized out how you do these things. And so it's very clear. Right now, it's not clear. You got pieces and parts in every
That's-
different direction. So that is the goal, is to simplify it and to make a list so people know what is required.
And excuse me for stepping on you for a second, Bill and Wendy, that's something that's really bothered me. And you're talking about laying out something, you can do this or you can do this. And here's what you do under A, here's what you can do under B, rather than I think the learning curve that was so painful with the tree ordinance was trying to see the forest for the individual trees, to use a metaphor with each ordinance. So love to hear more about that. Bill.
So when we were talking about this last go around, I was discounting Rob's idea of this prescriptive thing, but now that we're coming back around, I think it makes a lot of sense. And Rob has dealt with this. He has been in the throes of it for years, so he understands it better. Maybe he could help us understand what he's talking about. And then with the statisticals, it's not clear, but we do sometimes tell our clients when they come and say, oh my gosh, we need a whole tree survey. We say, no, we can support you by doing a statistical, and we do a lot of them. So that's all.
Right now, it's not specifically stated in the ordinance, but there's no reason that we couldn't say that, right? And come up with the language that, they have to be substantially similar in areas and stuff like that. That's what we tell people. But even in the ordinance that we've been talking about, like to make it more clear, it doesn't specifically call it out. So I'm making a note.
Wendy.
Okay, I'll be brief. I just want to reiterate, because it's, it came up yesterday and we keep saying it over and over and over, that we want to simplify, but we can be more stringent. And I think that that's a clarification from yesterday, because I think that there was an assumption that simplifying means making the standards lower. I don't think that that's necessarily true. I'm all about simplifying. I've loved the prescriptive idea from day one. I nod vigorously every time you open your mouth, Bob. And then my other question is, and this is an ecosystem or habitat type question for Keith or Bill or any of you who are just very familiar with the entire county. Just like groundwater varies and soils vary, is every area of this county supposed to be forested, even if it was clear cut 100 and 150 years ago? Were we originally forested everywhere, besides marshland? And so is the goal to reforest the entire county? Is that the goal? And so are there places, let's say you're building on a cattle pasture that has already been clear cut, then yeah, you're not required to put so many trees back in because, you got that land already cleared. But is the goal to reforest it? is it appropriate? And again, putting the right plant in the right place. You want to make sure you're planting appropriately for the soils, the water, the habitat, the original habitat type. It gets complicated there, but do we, in the goal of simplifying, but perhaps having more stringent rules, are we still shooting ourselves in the foot to have kind of a one size fits all policy?
So can I just speak to that real
Mhm.
quick? In the council program, we have something in there about adding a waiver to the tree minimum standards based on site specific conditions to address that issue, because right now there's not. But, again, it seems like we're getting into the individual weeds of this instead of kind of what we had said. We were going to look at the big picture, stick with the council work plan, make votes on those types of things. But it's up to you how you want to do
Well,
this. However, I want to make a correction about the statistical tree analysis. It's in 72836 E2. It states in there, how you're supposed to do that. So I wasn't
And
going to say you were wrong.
just for Dr. Anderson, the county has habitat maps about what was everywhere. Like they have the gopher tortoise map, so that information is available. And to my knowledge, not everything was forested. Bill?
I think you're right. Back, pre-Columbian, let's say. Only places that are herbaceous marsh or herbaceous prairie would have not been forested. Most of our rolling sandhills and even some of our flatwoods would have been really old growth longleaf pine at 50 trees per acre, or maybe 5 trees per acre. But then we as humans came in, cut the whole eastern seaboard at the turn of the century. So, and then we did citrus. So that's when it really was, and cattle. That's when it was really herbaceous.
And historically,
I'm sorry, Bliss? Yeah.
just historically too, if you think about it and read about some of the history, Florida burned.
It's supposed to burn.
And, everybody wants to save a forest, but they don't want to manage it. And too much density creates a very big hazard. But back in the days, there are records of people that could see for miles off the top of a hill because Florida burned and there weren't as many trees as you think.
As a county, we do controlled burns, but as development has encroached on those areas that need to burn, we don't burn, and we pay a price for that. Bliss?
Just one comment. We've said it in different ways, but trees are a renewable resource. And here, when you compare that to water quality is not that fixable. But trees are replaceable, renewable resource, and many times cash crops.
So I would, Wendy, and then Ginger.
So I love this conversation about the different habitat types. And that was in my head when we were talking about a prescriptive approach as well, because one good thing about the removal and replacement is that replacement is based on what you have. And if you have an area, say it's in scrub, where you really don't have a lot of protected trees, then you're not putting back trees and changing that habitat. Now, if you're putting a house on it, you're probably changing the habitat. People are going to plant, stupid stuff and whatever. But so in that way, the removal and replacement is more suited to like different habitat types of, was it a very forested area or wasn't it at the time of permit? Not to say that you couldn't figure that out in a prescriptive approach, but in one way it may be a little bit more complicated, because would you say you have a minimum, whatever it is, DBH or whatever your measurement is, there's a number you have to get to when you're done, but would that be dependent on your type of habitat? And like, what if part of your lot is marshy? Well, would you count that toward your 50 trees per acre? Like, I guess we would just have to be very deliberate about what the prescription is based on maybe where you started. I don't know.
And even that gets tricky because, for instance, let's say we could develop in Tomoka State Park, not, but let's say we could. That's not a pristine forest. It's got indigo in there from when that was cropped. It has. We walk in and we go, oh, this is a wonderful nature walk. A botanist or an arborist walks in and go, what the heck happened here? Because of what's happened over time, and the land it's reforested itself. I would, Bill asked if Bob could, or if staff understands what exactly Bob means about the prescriptive approach, to understand how that would be workable if, once again.
I'll tell you what I think I understand, and maybe it's right and maybe it's not, is that rather than what we do now with removal and replacement calculations, and we'll set aside specimens and historics for the moment, that there's just a number of trees or number of square inches or a number that you have to get at the end. And how you get there could be the same as now, right? You could plant or you could preserve. I guess if it's a minimum, you can't pay, right? But how you get there on your site is less important than that you get to a certain minimum standard of tree coverage. Rather than sort of right now, the incentive is to not cut down trees because you have to replace what you cut down, right? So it's.
But with
Mitigation method, you get to a point to where you just lose lots on subdivisions. Depending on how much area you're cutting down. If you get to that number, if there's not a preserve, plant, or pay, there's not a third option. There's a potential where you're like, well, you're not going to meet your minimum. How many lots are you going to cut off to meet your minimum?
in terms of, so I thought I got it. The less math and no pie method, which is there are this many trees and we're going to keep 80% of them. And, well, no, not 80, but whatever. No.
I don't even think it's about how many you started with. It's like at the end, everybody has 50 trees per acre. Or some standard, but at the end, you have this much of trees.
That piece.
Okay. So,
Yeah, 50, I would object to, but.
so we've heard what's positive about that. Now I want to hear what's bad about that after Jessica and Bliss.
If that standard, would that canopy have to be in a tree protection area? That's the problem. That's the problem. That's the problem.
Why would you, I mean,
Well, currently you
have the
you have
15%.
you have your 15% tree preservation area. Obviously, that would work into it. Now you have to have an NVRA area over top of the tree preservation area. So you would have to make that tree preservation that NVRA area kind of similar in my opinion. So it would be an addition to.
But we don't put trees that you put on individual lots, one tree per 25 acres in a tree protection area, right? And that's what you're talking about.
So real quick, way long ago, we talked about a couple of us getting together and trying to put something, and that never happened. I don't know whether Chris, well, I think he said all we had to do was publish. I mean, make it public, and we could, 2 or 3 of us, get together and work on that issue. Is that correct, or am I misguided?
It's possible, but it has to be, minutes have to be taken, has to be published. So there are some hurdles to go through for sure. But it is possible. There can be additional minutes taken.
Or
I'm still willing to do that. I'm gonna speak for
Chelsea said she'd quit if she had to sit through those meetings. She was looking at me like,
Well, maybe I can just have a suggestion. Maybe that's something that, you task staff to see what other counties are doing or how other replacement is done in other areas, and we bring it back to you and you guys take a look at that. I don't know. We can't decide that. Someone has to make a motion or direct staff to bring back more information to you.
I'd almost rather that we hash it out expeditiously. We've kind of heard the benefit in terms of speeding things up or making them less complicated, not necessarily, but we haven't talked about what the unintended consequences might be. And I need to recognize Tyler, Bliss, and Jessica.
Okay, so I think the question that you had of would we need to have a tree protection easement over the trees that we're putting in on a prescriptive basis? If we're preserving existing trees, or if we're using NVRA's natural vegetation retention area, at least for the minutes, what that's referring to is us getting credit for existing trees smaller than 6 inches. So they're not legally trees yet, but they can be counted towards our replacement value. This is all the complexity of what we deal with. So if you're preserving a natural area on the property and preserving the trees in it and counting it towards the credit, I think that makes sense to have a tree preservation area. But I think consistent with how the code is applied today, that if you're planting replacement trees along a road, whether it's on somebody's lot or in the road right of way, that it doesn't necessarily make sense to have a tree protection easement over it, because that means, what does somebody in 20 years, what can they do to the trees? But, maybe we do need to have some type of the survivorship that those trees have to be here in 5 years. Or I know Port Orange has something that's maybe a little stricter than what I think works well, but there is a balance to be had there. But I don't think individual lots with a bunch of easements on them is the goal that we should strive towards.
Well, and we don't like those individual tree easements. The nuance here is that under the current system, if you don't remove a tree, you don't have to replace it. But if at some point you want to remove it, assuming it's not on a single family lot, which is exempt after it's owner occupied, right? But if at some point in the future you want to remove it, then you will have to replace it then, right? So they're still protected because we have removal and replacement. If what we get to is a certain number per acre or whatever, those trees aren't protected anymore because you don't have a mechanism to permit its future removal. You see what I'm saying? So then the question is, how do you protect those 10 trees per acre in the future, because you've removed the removal and replacement requirement, right? So that's where, yeah, maybe you do want all your trees that count toward your minimum to be in some sort of protected area, although I don't think that's really very effective, because in theory, they're kind of mixed around in your site, right? So how do you protect them next year if you didn't take it out this year?
I mean, but what you're talking about are existing trees that are preserved, that are so we didn't have to deal with replacement during development. But we don't specifically protect the replacement trees that are that are planted to replace the trees that are cut down. So in the future, those can be dealt with in a different mechanism as well, right?
Well, what happens now is you planted a tree in your parking lot at the 7-Eleven, and 10 years from now, you want to remove it, you have to come and get a tree removal permit for it, and we require you to replace it. But if you don't have removal and replacement requirements, if all you have is a minimum number requirement, then let's say you plant your minimum number at your 7-Eleven, and in 10 years, you come in to take trees out of the parking lot. How do we make sure that you replace them?
Okay, so let's set 7-Eleven aside. Let's pretend it's a residential subdivision, the tree's in somebody's front yard. 10 years down the road, the person cuts the tree down.
Well, if it's an owner occupied lot at that point, it's exempt, and only if it's historic. That's right.
Which is
and
what I'm saying, is those trees aren't currently protected.
But typically we don't let the replacement requirement for the subdivision occur in an individual lot. If you're taking trees out in your subdivision for your road and your stormwater and all that, and you're putting in replacement trees, you're not putting them on the lots. You're putting them in common areas. You're putting them in easements. You're putting them in landscape buffers. You're putting them in your tree preservation area. They're not going on the lot because I can't make sure that that tree stays once it's an owner occupied lot.
I'm gonna have to review some plans because all the other municipalities count the trees on the lots, and it's just been a long time since I've done one in Volusia County.
We count the trees on the lots, but we count the minimum standards on the
Yeah.
lots, and they have to remain for 2 years. So if you're talking about doing, what you're doing, you would almost have to do away with the exemption for trees on lots. So that means single-family residential lots would have to come in and permit their trees for removal. And I don't have the staff for that.
It wouldn't have to come in at all. They just have to meet whatever that prescriptive minimum was.
And when they
They would
don't,
have to
and when they
permit.
don't, when they don't do that, that is a violation of the code. And then you need staff to take them to the code board. You have inspections and people are going to want to remove trees. That will be a nightmare. I'd have to double staff to deal with all the lots in an incorporated Volusia County.
So you offered a little earlier, Keith, to try to find some other ordinances that we might review. And, I would love to see an ordinance out there, and I believe there are some that are based on a prescriptive method rather than what we go through. So, I mean, that's a great place to start if we can. If Chris won't set us up a little mini meeting.
About that is we're not going to have this done today, but I was overly ambitious. Jessica.
And I asked about the TPA because we run into it a lot in our plans, and we run into it in the context of tree preservation area versus common open space requirements, and how much can they overlap? And it's, something that has to be reviewed, and kind of making those pockets of, okay, you need 15% canopy, you need this much natural vegetation, you need this much open space. They should all overlap. And so it's building in kind of that plan of making sure they overlap and how that operates. So I'm pointing it out as I would flag this as an issue. We can probably work around it. I mean, there are a lot of jurisdictions that say, and I'm not going to say who because I don't know if it's strict application of the minimum standards. Yeah. But where they say 15% canopy preservation or planting to that standard to 15% coverage on the lot. And then they just say you have a residential subdivision, you have that 15%, you have the 1 per 2,500, and you have 1 tree per lot in the front yard. Or 1 tree per every 40 linear feet or whatever it is. So that if you have 50, you have 2. And you have to meet all of those. But then you can have trees on lots that count. And so there are ways to do it, but it does go back to enforcement. I mean, but I think our current system goes back to enforcement. So, yeah.
The current system is for enforcement for the new lots after 2 years, then all that enforcement goes away. And like we discussed with the historic trees, we have a tree on a lot and it's hanging over a house. You have to provide some sort of permitting system if you're protecting that tree. And that takes staff time. HOAs go defunct all the time and then we're left with nothing.
Friends, we are at the 2:38 mark, and usually at 2:30 we succumb to biology. So is it okay to stop for 10 minutes and take a little, come back in 10 and keep going? Doo-doo-doo. Going once, going twice. Musical chairs, you're going to lose your seat. Oh, no, 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 no. I got enough problems. Yeah. Yeah, I'll think no. So let's start this up again. And just to, sorry. So the land development code, to answer a question that came up, Tyler, that came up a while ago. The purpose and jurisdiction under the land planning for trees is protect and preserve trees and enhance tree cover. But that's a great statement. It's big, it's broad. To get there, it's proving complicated. And it was brought forth that maybe we're actually closer to maybe being simpler in achieving that. Simpler in how? Or maybe not, because Ginger's talking about if we went to just saying we're going to save 20 trees on a property, to make a silly example, what happens in 5 years and someone cuts down 2 of them? How are we keeping 20 on that property? Yeah.
So I don't know if I should put this in a motion or not, but Keith and I had a conversation real quick about providing examples of ordinances that use prescriptive methods. So yes, that should be.
Yes, because I think it should, right? Because we ask staff to do that, or no? No, they're just going to do that. Okay. Shall we then continue with another portion of this ordinance?
Wait,
Oh, no,
I'd like to better understand what is going to happen. Essentially, you're looking at other ordinances from other places that are more in line with what Bob has been talking about. Is that right? And so you're going to come back and say, in Orange County, they do this, which is closer to a prescriptive method. Is that what's going to happen?
We'll try.
We can look for that. We can look for other ordinances in the area and provide a couple of different solutions or different ways than the way we do it. So maybe there's a different way that we're not aware of. We can look for other ways to do it and bring back those.
Yeah, that's where I was going, because versus just looking at these other places, I think it'd be good if you interpreted what they said and said, hey, maybe there's a step in between that makes even more sense. But I do think we may very well be closer here, because we may end up, the net may be we have more trees and a more simplified system, which would be a beautiful thing. So, it's something that we may be closer to it than we know, and perhaps these other folks have some insight that knock out a few of our negatives that are associated to it. So thanks.
It's to add on to that, as you're exploring these different codes or regulations, pick up the phone and call your cohorts and ask about the pros and cons of each.
Thank you.
Right, because if somebody picked up our code and looked at how we do it, they would not necessarily get the picture of how we do it, because the code is so out of date and whatever. So yes, we would definitely talk to those folks as well. Okay, so this slide is the potential replacement changes. I think we'll skip that, right? And then we're going to go to, okay.
Last or next to last bullet point, perpetuity, is that the right word? Because that means forever and ever and ever. I mean, 1,000 years from now, you're not gonna have that tree there, or 100 years from now.
Yeah, I think that means the natural life of the tree that can be changed to something like that. It's again, it's always going to be about condition. Like you could plant a tree and in 20 years it could have a major defect or some disease, hit it and it needs to come out. So again, everything's always going to be about condition of the tree.
Let's clarify that if we could, please.
Yeah. And maybe you need to put a pool in or something, right? Then you would have to, plant it somewhere else or replace it or something like that.
Okay, Keith says we're not skipping this. So one of the questions was require additional tree replacement if it's a subdivision and the proposal is to clear all the lots.
Okay, what I would skip is the first one of this one because we need to look at the replacement, right? So we'll table that first one. I think the next three should be fairly easy. So we're talking about palm replacements. There's a section of the current code that talks about palms. It's very complicated. It's a reduction of the palms. So what we're talking about doing is remove that section either altogether and just replace palm for palm. And when you get to doing cross-sectional square inches for palm trees, that's a monocot. It's not necessarily a tree. It's a grass anyway. I mean, you probably shouldn't be doing cross-sectional square inches. You could just do a palm for palm replacement or a palm for non-palm. So if you're taking out one 16-inch palm tree, you could plant it with a 2-inch oak tree or 2-inch magnolia tree. It would make it so much simpler when you wipe out a whole section.
So is the intent of this? Just I took out 4 sand live oaks and I put in 4 sable palms to try to meet a requirement.
So this is like if you have, let's say you have a site that's got 10 palm trees on it. Instead of counting every palm tree, doing a cross-sectional square inches and have to replace, a bunch of replacement trees, it would just be a 1-to-1 ratio for palms, either palm for palm or palm for non-palm.
But you can't replace a hardwood with a palm.
Right.
That's where
Right.
we're going here.
Right.
Yes.
Cannot. No pie. Yeah, but palms lack, secondary growth, so they're never going to get any bigger. They are what they are.
Is it 1-to-1 today? So this would be a gross increase in palm replacement?
What was your question?
No. How is this modifying the palm replacement required of today?
So technically, if you're replacing palm tree or replacing hardwoods with palm trees, you would have to take your total cross-sectional square inches of palm trees and divide it by 16. So yes.
Just the replacement required for palms today, what is it and what is it proposed to be? So if I cut down a sable palm today, regardless of its size, what am I required to replace?
So there's a chart in the code, and it has what you can replace these palms with and palms for. So what you can do is you can replace palm for palms, but it removes the section of the cross sectionals for palms and palms for non-palms. Yeah.
Right now, you have to do the cross-sectional calculation for palms. What we're proposing is that you don't do the cross-sectional calculation and you don't replace a non-palm with a palm. You don't have to do the complicated math. If you're taking out a hardwood, you're putting back a hardwood and just make it easier.
I'm good with that. It just sounded like we were gonna not allow a reduction in the count of palms on the site.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, you could do it the other way.
That's my question. That's what I
Yeah.
misunderstood.
You can't currently, but You can, yeah.
it's
So in
palm-
replacing a palm, yeah, and instead of replacing a palm with 2 or 3 trees, you would just replace it with 1 tree. Yeah, and currently you're not, what it said, the code says that we're supposed to replace like species trees unless you have our permission to do something different. Well, we typically don't allow you to replace a live oak with palm trees unless you're somewhere beachside where you have no option. Hmm?
Let me get this clear. So you can replace a palm with a hardwood.
Replace a palm with a
With
hard,
a non-
with a non-palm.
Right.
Not the way that we're talking about it right now.
Okay,
It would
so-
just be a palm for non-palm or a palm for a palm.
No? That's,
Yeah.
that's not what I. Hey, you're tricking me. You're tricking me on that language thing.
Right.
Now, what I'm saying, I have a palm tree. I want to cut it down, okay? And I want to replace it with an oak tree. Can I do that?
Yes, you can.
Okay.
John,
But you can't cut down an oak tree and replace it with a palm.
Jessica,
In the situation where you are on the beach and you should have palms for a non-palm or live, yes, sure. Potentially, could you put in that from a certain distance from Atlantic Ocean, you replace 2 palms for 1 non-palm in that situation where that species makes more sense for the location, so you're not stuck.
I think the answer is that when we're looking at site plans, we're trying to make sure that people are putting back plants that grow where they're putting them. I didn't quite follow the plant 2 palms back for a hardwood.
It's the it's the city of Daytona Beach standard is 2 palm trees can count for 1 non-palm tree. So that's if you had a non-palm and you had to replace, under your current rule, if you're on the beach, you can't. But could you say within 500 feet of Atlantic Ocean, you can at a ratio of 2 palms per the 1 tree, whatever.
We could, if that's what you tell us you want to do.
Currently replacements based on habitat. We have the habitat planning guidelines, and if you're in that habitat and you're replanting trees, we want you to plant trees that are based on that habitat type. So if you're, sea grapes, palm trees, sable palms, those types of things in those type of areas, yes.
Okay, I move to do what he said.
I second it.
To simplify the palm ordinance for direct replacement of palms for palms or non-palms for palms. 1 for 1.
any discussion?
And we need a second.
Okay.
Oh, he did second. Yeah. Okay, all those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Yay.
Another easy one here. Lower the minimum replacement size from 2-inch caliper to 1.5-inch caliper. So that's basically going to take your 30-gallon or 45-gallon, depending on your tree species, 2-inch caliper trees to a 15-gallon size tree. So it's going to make it easier for the mom and pops to go pick up their trees at a nursery and plant them themselves. It's going to make them cheaper. You'll be able to meet your minimum standards. It'll be cheaper to meet your minimum standards and have better survivability.
Move it.
Would,
Just to prove that I don't always disagree with you, Keith. I move we approve that one.
Yeah. Anna seconds. Any discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Donna.
So the third one is just to clarify in the code that existing trees on the site that are below 6 inches, so they'd be greater than the minimum size, which is now 1.5 inch caliper, up to 6 inches, can be used as replacement stock. It's just not real clear in the code right now.
Do we have? Yeah, we do. Would someone like to move? Okay, Jack Surratt moved and Jessica Gao seconded it. Any discussion? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, Sarah Lee. I'm so easily confused. Yeah. I didn't want to say, but any discussion?
I was just gonna say, if we come back and say we're not gonna have the complicated calculations on replacement because we're going with prescriptive, this might be moot. Yes, would it be moot? Oh. Okay.
Good question. Okay, any, Bob?
Yeah, this is one of the things about our existing ordinance that I've never been a fan of. So a minimum tree can be planted that's 1.5 inches in diameter now, based on our change. However, a tree that you save that's 1.5 inches or 2 inches in diameter cannot go towards the replacement. It has to be at least 6 inches in.
If it's put in the natural vegetation area, that.
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying. That's the philosophy here, is because 6 inches is a protected tree, that you don't get to count towards replacement stock any tree that's smaller than.
Tree, right now, trees
right,
under
yeah.
6 inches,
Under
6
six-
inches
yeah.
and below to what was
Right.
right, 2, can be counted as replacement. A tree that's 6 inches can't count as replacement because it's protected.
Right, even though it's in an area that it's being saved.
Right. Because
That's-
that tree's already protected. You don't get to count you don't
Right.
get credit for protecting it
I
because it's protected.
But you saved
You
the
don't have to
tree.
replace it.
But you but you saved the tree. Any rate, that has always been, an aspect of the ordinance. And then the other part of that is to utilize the credit. If you're talking about it, now I'm out there surveying 1.5 to 5.9 inch trees.
Which you can do on a statistical analysis. We allow that as well. And maybe that's something that we should clarify in our list of tree permit application requirements. But yeah, so you can do your statistical for those and get a per cross-sectional square inch per square foot and find your replacement that way.
Vegetation of tree species that are being used as replacement stock for removed trees. A tree is 6 inches and larger. If by code, by definition, a live oak that has a 4-inch diameter breast height is not a tree. It's not
No, it's not a protected tree. So there's a definition of a tree, and then there's a definition of a protected tree, which is 6 inches and greater.
Maybe this has changed since I read it. It's that. But that's part of it, is I thought that a tree was the one that's 6 inches and above.
A protected tree. So,
Protected tree.
right.
Okay, so maybe this is a point of confusion of mine that I need to go do my homework on. My apologies. The second thing I was going to bring up is more the discussion of replacement. How do you incentivize that a large tree be preserved if it's prescriptive? I think this is exactly the point that Bob was making.
Trying to make.
Is that right now in our tree preservation areas, we save a 24-inch live oak. It's a beautiful tree. We don't get credit for it, but we don't get penalized to where we have to replace. But what would further incentivize our protecting that tree versus another tree on the site or combination of trees on the site would actually be to have that prescriptive coverage, because that 24-inch tree has a lot of value in it versus a bunch of 3-inch or 4-inch trees that we can grab in NVRAs or replacement stock. So not really as much on the item that we're discussing, but just because there is a lot of replacement versus credit or whatever discussion, preserving trees is incentivized.
I think the sense of the committee is we want to preserve the trees and we do want to make this simpler. So hopefully the examples of codes from elsewhere will help us. Is this a decision point that we can proceed with though? Okay. Yes, we were doing discussion, weren't we? Thank you. Any further discussion? Could you restate the motion again, please? Because I'm afraid I'll misdo it.
Yeah. Clarify in the code that replacement can include retaining existing native trees between 1.5 inches and 5.9 inches DBH.
Thank you. And we had that seconded. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Great. Motion carries.
The next bullet point is add that replacement trees must remain in perpetuity. We had a little bit of discussion about that. So, what would you like us to add besides perpetuity?
Yeah, take perpetuity out. The trees must remain preserved for its life.
Currently, replacement trees on single-family lots have to remain for 2 years.
2 years.
2 years.
I want to clarify that I was right.
The life of the tree.
What?
They are 6 inches in your definition.
What, protected trees?
Trees. 15 feet tall, 6-inch diameter at breast height.
Okay, we'll look.
Yeah.
So, how long?
I say they should be preserved as long as they're healthy and viable. I mean, their lifespan of the tree. Lifespan of the tree, yeah.
It is nice. It's ambiguous.
Tyler, were you looking at definitions in chapter 72? Is that?
72 definitions,
Okay.
tree.
Okay, and then the last item on here was, and we don't need a motion for this because you don't know specifically what they are, but we have identified some places where there's inconsistencies or need for more clarity. Parking?
Sorry. I have your answer. 72,842. It has the size 6 feet high, 2 inches for replacement trees.
Yeah,
So
but the definition of tree is any woody self-supporting plant characterized by having a single trunk of at least 6 inches DBH or multi-stem trunk system with well-developed crown at least 15 feet high as measured from its base shall be considered a tree.
Yeah, that's the definition of protected tree, but and there.
No, he says it's tree. So I remember, so we stand corrected, but we were proposing to add a definition of protected tree to make that clarity, right? Because something less than 6 inches is still a tree. So we were gonna clarify that.
It's not
chapter
currently a
72.
tree. It should be a tree, but it's not currently a tree. So the clarification that we're voting on here is going to be muddy as crap if we don't also have the protected tree definition included, right? Okay, I couldn't listen because there wasn't a recording and there weren't minutes. So I'm sorry, I missed the last discussion. Oh.
Who's going to jump?
Again, it was the replacement. the replacement trees must remain preserved for its natural lifespan.
Any seconds? Bliss seconds? Any discussion? Tyler has his name up.
Selves up for an argument with using, I agree with it. I think we should have a chart. I'm just suggesting maybe we include that.
I guess it's that was instead of in perpetuity. So I mean, the other alternative is as long as the tree is healthy, right? Or doesn't meet the definition of deteriorated. That could be an alternative.
Bill,
This trees must remain healthy and preserved, period.
I, so John has to amend his motion to what Keith or Ginger said.
Yeah, so for the, what did I say? As long as the tree is not considered deteriorated, right? Because we have a definition of deteriorated.
And do we have a second of the?
Bliss second.
Yes, but you're okay with it too, right? Good. Any further discussion? Are you putting your name? Okay. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries.
Okay, this is a topic we actually talked about a year ago about, so currently 15% of the square footage of any development must be designated for the protection of existing trees. We saw this diagram last time. This is, in this example, what 15% of a commercial site looked like. We talked about potential changes, and this actually was something that was discussed by council, was this idea of a graduated level of tree preservation area in sensitive areas, including Norma and Eco. You know, maybe it's not 15% in those areas. We had a little diagram. I'm going to skip. We had a diagram that we talked about last year, like what does 20% look like? What does 25% look like? Ultimately, last year, March 1st, you all voted to not have graduated protection. You voted to leave the tree preservation area at 15% in all areas of the county. So unless someone on the prevailing side of that vote wants to revisit it, that was the decision at this time last year.
I no longer remember the discussion around that, but I find it odd that we didn't ask for further protections in Norma and Eco.
Wendy made the motion on that one. Tyler was the second, and it passed unanimous for everybody that was at the meeting except for Bill. Bill voted no. To change the language. The no was to, do we want to increase tree retention areas in Norma and Eco? And the answer was no, we want to leave the whole thing at 15%. Yes. I yeah, yeah.
Sounds like Bill's the only one that had a clue.
Yep.
That's why I'm saying, I'm wondering, that's, well, it doesn't sound like us. To leave it at 15.
That wasn't how it happened, though.
Well, Wendy made the motion, she can.
No, someone on the prevailing side. Yeah.
Let's revisit it.
Here, I'm gonna, can I share with you the minutes? So, I asked if you wanted to increase it in Eco and Norma. Bill responded, he would not be in favor of an increase of greater than 15% in Norma and would like to open space inclusion use landscape buffers. There was a whole lot. So Wendy expressed support of open space. So having the tree preservation be open space, overlap, right? We talked about whether retention areas are counted. So Wendy motion to accept sections A through E, but not include the landscape buffers in the 15%. That failed because there was no second, right? So then we talked a little bit more. Discussion included allowing landscape buffers to count toward preservation if it remains in its natural state. Member Anderson motion to approve as written, like approve the code as it's written.
To approve the proposed change as written.
I don't think, that's not how like after the meeting, we were all like, oh, I guess we're not increasing anything. Yeah. And so, and then it was actually, it wasn't Tyler, it was Bernie that seconded the motion and then. So if that was not the intent, we can revisit it if one of the prevailing members.
I move we revisit.
Okay.
Do we have a second to revisit it?
Yeah.
Sarah Lee seconds. Okay, discussion.
Well, I think you probably need to vote to do the revisiting and then do discussion on how you want to proceed.
Okay. Oh, Suzanne.
I wasn't here then, so do I vote on this to bring it back again?
Yes,
Yes.
you do. Thank you.
That's a good question.
Okay, all those in favor of revisiting? Aye. Any opposed? The motion carries to revisit this.
Did you read the code?
So there is no code language. Well, so what the code now says is 15% of the land area of all development must be set aside for the preservation of trees. It doesn't apply to existing single-family lots, right? Platted lots. The proposal would be that the question is 15% enough tree preservation? And this was one of the things that came to council because, people were at council hollering about these clear-cut areas, right? Where's the tree preservation? So there had been discussion at council in the work plan, the council work plan about, is the 15% tree preservation the right percentage? And should there be graduated protection in these other areas like Norma and Eco? And then we had the Norma map and the Eco map up when we were doing these discussions.
Okay. Wendy.
I just want to add to it add what she said real quick. I just want to add to that the county forester can provide a waiver to that. So if you have a subdivision that's like all pasture or something like that, we would take a look at that and say, hey, this has been agricultural for years and years and years, and I can provide a waiver to that section for site-specific reasons.
Bob, I was reading from the minutes from the March 1st, 2023 meeting, and that was, this discussion started on page 6, but the motion is on page 7, line 31.
Keith wanted to make a clarification and Bob asked a question. So it was Wendy's question and then you, Jack.
Right. So obviously I'm still scratching my head about why I would make such a motion. And I do remember objecting deeply, and I still do, to not including to saying we should not be including the trees in the required buffer in the tree preservation area. And the point there was that oftentimes these buffers are so narrow that the trees don't really survive. And it's just not a healthy environment for the trees by the time you've done all the things. But I vaguely remember, and maybe there's something in the notes about this, that when we did talk about NERMA and ECO, that those are already protected areas. And even though you can get a variance to push into them, there's no.
I would say there's nothing in Norma and Eco that precludes development. Now, there's not typically urban development. You're right.
Right.
Well,
Okay,
you can, there's an increased wetland buffer in Norma, but yeah.
In other words, properties within Eco and Norma
Can still be
can be
developed.
still developed.
Okay.
It's right. So again, it is a situation that the Norma just puts a heightened level of protection and heightened standards in regards to wetland protections.
But the percentages are the same. The 15% are the same.
Correct.
You could have a site in Norma that doesn't have any wetlands on it at all. It could be completely upland, right? So then it would just be the typical 15% like it is everywhere else. So do you want to increase that in those areas is the question.
I think you just showed us, oh, there it is, the comparison, 115 and the other 20.
No, this is
Because if I'm not mistaken, Tyler had a great rebuttal to the 20% that this project wouldn't happen because of this increase in that or something, if I remember.
this project did happen, and that's the approved plan that happened on this particular property. Now, the first one is 15%. The top one is 15, and then the additional, what's that blue? Blue area is it's 20. Yep.
I think the difference between the 15 and 20 in this conversation was that this project wasn't feasible as a result. Maybe I'm wrong.
The areas that he has in blue.
Would not count under the code, the landscape buffer and all that, right?
Creating or some other activity happening, it can't happen within a tree preservation area. Yeah, and each of the three locations. My apologies. One of the reasons or biggest reasons they didn't move forward is we had a really big tree replacement cost and or tree fund cost because this is dense trees. The whole site was trees and they weren't necessarily high value in the sense of they weren't historic or we didn't have a lot of qualifying specimen trees, but we had a lot of nasty oaks out there that had big trunks and we couldn't replant fully on the site. So they reduced just to make it economically viable, which I think when this came up previously, the discussion that I had added was, hey, you see, I was able to permit it, but it wasn't economically viable. So the tree replacement code is doing its job of holding us to a higher standard than 15% unless there's a really driving economic demand for land in that area. And so that's why I was against increasing the minimum 15% area to a larger percentage.
There aren't a lot of projects commercial projects in Norma anyway, in Norma and Eco. So that's something to keep in mind. But this project happened. This was an old home site. So it wasn't like the entire site was heavily treed. There was a yard, there was a backyard. It wasn't like it was wall to wall trees. It was redevelopment. Yeah.
I could only walk 100 feet on the site and it's like 500 feet deep. Until geotech took
There was
their
extensive bamboo on the site, which you don't have to replace.
So in general, NERMA and ECO have very many requirements to limit development. And again, in general, I don't see the need to increase the tree preservation area from 15 to 20 or 25. And why? Why would you do that? So I don't support increasing the tree preservation area.
About a commercial site. I'm the one who always brings up industrial sites. And then Keith just mentioned Norma. Well, if you go back and look at the maps about Norma, you know, that was a wide brush of really anything that is not within a city is in Norma. And if you look at future developments or the future demand for development in the areas of the county and the undeveloped areas of the county, a lot of development is potentially going to be in Norma. So yes, as Keith pointed out, there are plenty of uplands within Norma, but there are some wetlands. And Keith and I spoke during the break about, you know, this prescriptive minimum for the tree preservation and how that would, and if it would affect an industrial development. And I'm talking 20, 50, 100-acre tracts of land. I'm not talking about a 1-acre tract. And if you go back to the council meeting, we don't want to discourage business.
Clay, would, there are already restrictions in Norma and they exist for a reason. I don't know. I don't know if you want to revisit that for a second or it's not germane.
Let me give you some background. Okay, and I'm going to contradict a statement by what Keith was saying. Norma was based on in 1989, based on quad maps, and basically folks from county attorney's office and the planning office looked at it and started drawing in broad strokes around wetlands. So the whole idea was that Norma was to identify the wetland communities in Volusia County, unincorporated Volusia County. So it does have majority based on what were 1990 or 1989 quad maps. Again, that's why we have policies in there to allow us to ground truth exactly where wetlands are and some of these other things as well. So as you look at it, Norma also was primarily in the agricultural, forestry resource, and conservation area. So I am not certain that you will have a considerable number of commercial areas in there. Even with something like the commercial space industry opportunity overlay, we still said that you still had to abide by the environmental standards. Because when we went forward with that overlay, there was an outcry that this was a way to undermine the Norma and ECO requirements. And so therefore, it was made very clear in the policies that that was not the case. So if y'all feel that additional protection is needed, that's it's your decision to make it. I just want to make sure that everybody understands that the intent behind Norma is that it's low intensity residential development that occurs in these environmentally sensitive areas. That's it. It does not prohibit development. It just restricts it, and it puts additional environmental standards in regards to buffering. So if you feel that, as we've done with wetland buffering, where we require a strict 25 feet outside of Norma, but 50 feet within Norma, if you feel similar situations should be applied to tree preservation, that's your prerogative.
Thank you, Clay. Observation I'd like to make, if I may. Norma is also, if I'm not mistaken, there's wildlife corridor through Norma.
They're very, very close. There's some areas because of the age of Norma and the age of the wildlife corridor, they may not jive exactly.
Okay, thank you. We have said some things that some trees are, I think, trashy trees, I think was the word. Habitat preservation does matter. We're not there yet, but I'm gonna just make an Audubon statement. We have lost 60%, 40 to 60% of some of our songbird species because of we've taken away habitat and what we put back is non-native. So I do want to say that trees have value to wildlife species, but that's all I'm going to say about this at the moment. Sarah Lee.
The Norma designation does not survive annexation. It doesn't exist in cities.
But wait, let me clarify, but we do have the right through the VGMC to identify it as part of their annexation process. We can identify that the area was natural resource management area and that these were the land use and zoning designations. So if there's a situation where we see that there's an egregious change going, say, from the land, remember, Norma is not a land use category, it's an overlay. So if a city annexes in a city, a parcel that has, say, agricultural uses, and we see that they're proposing to do something of a nature that's not consistent with how it is, we can express concerns through the VGM, Volusia Growth Management Commission, that under the current rules and regulations, that does not necessarily cause for a public hearing because the rules have been reduced in regards to what the county can say on some of the cities and vice versa. But we do have the ability to voice concerns over any kind of intensification that we feel is inappropriate. I can't think of any in the 8 years that I've been here, to be very honest with you. Yes.
Yeah, so the additional protections that we have in the environmental codes is really limited to the fact that the wetland buffer is increased. So most of the county, the wetland buffer is 25 feet. In Norma, it's 50 feet. Any other protections that are afforded Norma have to do with future land use or whatever. Really, the main thing that's different in Norma than everywhere else is the wetland buffer, and that's it. Well, in theory, the minimum standard applies everywhere, including within the cities. And so those cities should have ordinances that protect trees, wetlands, all the things. But the Norma designation doesn't exist in a city. So they don't, they're not required to have an increased wetland buffer because they don't recognize Norma as a thing. It's in our comprehensive plan. It's not in their comprehensive plans. So they don't have to have an increased buffer in Norma if it's in the city.
We do have a real world example that went through with Farmington, where portions of Farmington were annexed into the city of Edgewater. We required them to put in their comprehensive plan similar policies. They've since, as for that particular thing, they've identified compliance with the natural resource management area requirements of the comp plan.
But this will not survive annexation either because this is chapter. Yeah, right.
I don't know the order anymore, so I think I'm gonna go Jessica, Bill, Tyler, Jack. Jessica, Tyler, Jack.
A question on the, and I know we probably did this last time, but I don't remember. On the tree preservation area increase and Norma, does that include wetland area or wetland buffer?
The wetland and the wetland buffer can count toward the tree preservation area.
Doesn't.
Yeah.
If it's not a surface water, right? If the wetland is a surface
If-
water, you're not gonna let us count it towards tree preservation.
Yeah,
right?
if it's open water and there aren't trees in it, then yeah.
Right, so Norma is set up to protect our predominantly wetland areas. We're gonna have preservation of a large swath of people's lands. We have an increased buffer on it. They have to put tree preservation either within that buffer or the upland area. If we increase the percentage of conservation, we're going to be reducing the developable upland area. We're substantially limiting development capability on this land. Through this committee, I've learned that roughly 35% of our county is in permanent conservation, whether it's government ownership of an easement or an easement that has been granted through one of these development processes or otherwise. Of the land that is left to develop, we're still setting aside another 15%. Wetlands are protected additionally beyond that. We don't have a lot of developable land left when we start carving out all the protections. I think increasing this just really shoots ourselves in the foot as a county. So I'm going to be against it.
It was next Jack, then Bob.
Just a couple things. One, I was a member of the Volusia Growth Management Commission for 5 years, and no one ever came in front of them. And basically it was a rubber stamp because of the comprehensive plan in particular. And so, I never saw an objection made by anybody ever. That one of the reasons I quit that and came here is for better protection. But I wonder about eco too, eco, right? And eco doesn't have it more than the 15%, but it does have more protection than Norma. Okay, there you go. So
Because
it
it's part of-
does. And so that's, but that's the only thing. So theoretically, and that is more protected area for a reason, I'm assuming, right? And so maybe there's a place there where there could be additional protection beyond the 15% versus Norma. And so maybe there's something there because it's more precious, if you will. But the debate, it's funny because it sounds like the debate we had before was just the opposite of what it was. And, and so it's really good we are looking at this again. Because I'm leaning to the protection is adequate today in Norma, but would like to look at echo more.
Yeah, Tyler brought up something that I've asked before. When have we preserved enough? Is it 50%? Is it 60%? Is it 70%? John had an interesting question he didn't get an answer to from a chief biologist at the state level. When do we take the manatees off the endangered list? When there's 100,000 of them, when there's 500,000, when there's 1 million? And the person said, I can't answer that question. I really think it's a fundamental question to what we're doing because we have to have areas for commercial activity and for people to live. So what is enough? I think we need to answer that.
You can't drop a bomb like that when we need to end probably about 5 minutes early because staff has a meeting, and that's a big deal question. And there are organizations that have posited how much is enough, but that's a pretty Bill,
Well, can we go to the question that we're voting on now? I might. Increase the tree preservation area requirement in environmentally sensitive areas. So I make a motion to vote no on that. Is that, I mean, I am saying correct.
Second.
any additional discussion?
Yes, I want
Jack.
to know about Echo. Let's talk about it as an exception from Norma. Because perhaps it should be more than just the 15%. So maybe you guys can describe the differences between the two and whether it's justified.
Jessica?
Eco is also another overlay. Right now, we have natural resource management area. We have environmental corridor overlay. And then we also have the commercial space industry overlay, opportunity overlay. Eco is a more refined area of Norma. Norma is larger. Eco correlates to the, I'm looking at it right now, the Florida Forever Priority A lands and portions of the environmental systems corridor. These are basically the areas that are not just the wetlands, but they're also the uplands to provide for that corridor through the basically the middle of the state. Exactly. And so Eco was identified as giving.
It was developed a little bit differently though than the wildlife corridor. It was basically a computer model that took all of the existing conservation lands or priorities and made connections, like through GIS, connected those areas to say, okay, where are the priority areas that we need to preserve so that wildlife has migration routes, right? So that these larger areas are connected. So it roughly follows some of those areas, but then it's not exact, right? Because it was a different exercise. But it's really intended to be those most important areas to conserve, to create that connectivity from
So,
to north.
And,
so to,
and just one other point, this came in the
Later.
early 2000s as Volusia County went through its smart growth initiative. And this was basically through that exhaustive discussion that went through, they said, this is the areas that we need to protect.
and that was the same time the Volusia Conservation Corridor was identified as well, about that time. So to recap what I'm hearing, so Norma was a less scientific methodology to establish, predating back in the 80s, based on wetlands. The environmental corridor overlay had more sophisticated thinking in it, but more importantly, it had a different kind of goal. It wasn't just wetland protection, it was prime habitat protection to especially allow for wildlife transit, which also preserves their biodiversity, keeps them from becoming too inbred, let me put it that way. So I think Jack is on to something, was saying rather than look at all of Norma, perhaps, maybe in the, I don't know.
Is it developable? Is it developable today? You know,
Yes.
and so the protections, what are the protections that are there that are different than Norma?
If you're within eco, you can do a conservation subdivision, which would allow for a density bonus so that you do clustering and those types of things that are basically trying to prevent sprawling type of. No, Farmington and Union. We actually have 2 applications in right now. Well, I mean, they're using them, so jack the price up for the forever acquisition.
Well, it's yes and no. It in the comprehensive plan, it says eco is important and it should be the most protected area. There aren't any chapter 72 regulations that say in eco, you have to do this much more, or there really aren't any regulatory protections. There are some protections because of the future land use that exists primarily in eco, right? So the density is often less. There is in the comp plan, the ability to do a conservation subdivision, which, I mean, you could maybe say that's more protective. It's just allowing a type of development that's not allowed in other places of the county. The only other thing is that we applied the 50-foot wetland buffer in eco. So if you're saying, show me the codes that say in eco, you have to do better, I can't.
And also just to clarify, it's a preventative measure from a staff's perspective, in that if we had anyone proposing to change the land use within these overlays, we would have justifiable reasons to deny any intensification. It's a protective measure.
And so I really go to the increase the tree retention. Do we get anything by increasing the tree retention within eco? Because it sounds like there's quite a bit there. But, you know, should we say, oh, it should be 20%, and does that make us happy?
You have to tell us what makes you happy.
You're the ones that are dealing with
Right.
it on a practical
So-
level. I'm just saying, hey, if, you know, if it's an improvement, we say, hey, there's,
I think it would follow through on the promise that there is more environmental protection within eco, because currently we really don't have anything that's different than that's in Norma for a Chapter 72 requirement. So, I mean, I think we'd be fulfilling that comprehensive plan, policy that it's more restrictive. How restrictive is up to you. Do you want 20% in eco? Do you want 25% in eco? That's what you have to flesh out.
And yeah. Jessica has a suggestion, she says.
And we're running out of time. I think that for this, something happened with the minutes. And we're not exactly sure what the former motion was. I want to say it was adopting 20% in Norma and 25 in eco, but you don't agree. Nobody agrees with that. So I think we need to kind of rewind the tape on that and figure out what that was. Maybe we can send the recording out to the team for homework. And get that discussion. I mean, I think part of the struggle and kind of what you're talking about is that tree preservation areas as a practice are supposed to be outside of lots. But Norma and eco have lower densities, which leads to larger lot sizes. So that also causes concerns. There's some interpretation that one of these, I think it's Norma, requires 1 acre lot sizes. It's just 1 unit per acre overall. But there are struggles in terms of how that's implemented with increasing tree preservation, having large lot sizes, and what that works out to. And so I don't think we're going to solve it today. And I'd like to know where we landed last time when we talked about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So, yeah.
It could be tabled. But we could also talk about.
Who gets to table? Do I get the table? Okay, who made the motion again? Bill. Okay. All those in favor of not increasing tree protection in Norma and eco, raise your hand, I think, at this point. I'm unsure. Motion carries.
Unfortunately,
Yeah.
Ginger and I have.
You can.
So I guess I get to say that we're adjourning for today.
Well,
Yes
so
or no?
next time we have a decision to make. Are we going to finish up with trees, or are we going to have stormwater folks come and do stormwater tomorrow, and we'll reconvene trees out?
Okay,
Yeah, so
wait, let's clarify, wait.
Uh,
I just want to clarify. The motion from that, Councilmember Santiago is to finish up the business you've got going and then get onto stormwater. I would please, because as you can see, you take a year, y'all can't remember what the hell y'all said back on March 23rd. Okay. All right.
I guess that, well, let me ask a question. Do we feel like we can kind of skip around a little bit, right? Like next week, next month, we could have, well, I know, but we could have the presentation from the stormwater folks. You could have homework. You could start learning about it. There's nothing that says we have to focus solely on stormwater for X number of time. We could weave trees back in there at some point. Yeah, agreed.
One item.
Okay. You're gonna have to, will you close me out of here?
And that's it.
Yeah, it was low impact. Okay, go ahead and go. We'll hash. I'll let you. Okay. The tree ordinance stuff, if you guys recall, we started out reading ordinances. We didn't work the way we're working now with a presentation from staff about what are the issues in a broad brush stroke. And maybe we're not going to make a decision, but I just want to revisit that. And we got very lost and very confused, and we couldn't make decisions because we were trying to both understand legal language and the actual underlying standards. And then we had to stop to work on LID because there was a grant timing. And we spent a lot of meetings working on LID, and then we moved on to stormwater. And it wasn't till now, almost a year later, that we've taken up trees again. And we have made progress since we took it up. So that's my point. That's what I'm. Maybe not. Informally, how many people want to finish trees? Well, let's get trees done because that's all these hands.
I'm not going to be able to do all that research. It will not be done by next meeting. There'll be another meeting on trees if you want to keep going with trees. Well, we've got, yeah, yeah, yeah. And when you meet with the stormwater people, you're going to have to give, they're going to have time to research the things you want them to research too. So these things take time. They take staff time. So it's not like you're going to be on stormwater and run it for the next 3 meetings. They're going to need time to do that work as well. So maybe it's a meeting that you have and you direct them to what you need. And then the very next one
Right.
is trees and then we finish it. I mean, it ultimately.
Does this make
you guys.
sense? Okay, it makes sense to me. Okay, so, well, yeah, so so everybody revisit trees in your own time as you wish for our, not next meeting, the meeting after that, and we will do stormwater at our next meeting. We'll start our learning on that. Yes, Jessica?
Because we don't remember, can we have the text of everything we have agreed to so far, like protected trees and whatnot, sent to us before the next time we reconvene? Or at
The
least a
minutes.
working Word document.
You want the minutes, the Word document.
Because I think you guys are tracking it in one document. If we could.
Yeah.
Like.
Bree,
Right.
do you,
The
Yeah.
minute.
Do you have-
minutes
you have-
don't reflect that.
you can extract it and send it out? Okay. And you want the recordings? The recordings are online. The recordings are online.
We are adjourned.
Okay, thank you.